The year was 1867, and the United States was a nation stitching itself back together with coarse thread. The Civil War had ended just 2 years prior, leaving behind a landscape of physical ruin and deep, festering social wounds. In the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, far from the grand narratives of Reconstruction and national healing, lay the small mining town of Blackwood. It was a community defined by soot and sinew, where men descended into the earth each day to extract the coal that fueled the nation's industrial engine, and where life was governed by the simple, harsh rhythms of labor, faith, and family. Blackwood was an insular place, suspicious of outsiders and deeply rooted in its own traditions. The town's heartbeat was the Caldwell family. Josiah Caldwell was the foreman at the Blackwood No. 3 mine, a respected man of stern demeanor and unshakable integrity. His wife, Eleanor, was the town's unofficial matriarch, a woman of profound kindness and unwavering Methodist faith. Theirs was an order and devotion, a sanctuary from the grime and danger of the pit. Their only child, Timothy, was born in the spring of 1856, a bright-eyed boy who seemed the embodiment of their hopes. He was a quiet, thoughtful child, known for his preternatural maturity and an intuitive kindness that endeared him to the entire community. The first sign that young Timothy's life would diverge from its seemingly preordained path occurred on the eve of his 11th birthday, in April of 1867. It began subtly. Timothy's mother, Eleanor, noticed that the boy's simple wooden top would sometimes spin on the floor of his room long after its momentum should have been exhausted. She dismissed it as a trick of the light or draft from the window. Then the family's mantel clock, a prized heirloom known for its impeccable accuracy, began to lose time whenever Timothy sat near it, only to resume its normal pace when he left the room. These were oddities, curiosities to be discussed in hushed tones over tea, but nothing more. The change accelerated dramatically one evening in late May. The Caldwells were hosting the local pastor for supper. The conversation turned to the week's sermon on the miracles of the New Testament. As the pastor spoke of faith moving mountains, the silverware on the table began to tremble. A gentle vibration at first, it grew into a distinct, rhythmic rattling that silenced the room. All eyes fell to the source, the cutlery arranged neatly before Timothy's place-setting. The boy looked down, his face paled with a confusion that mirrored everyone else's. Josiah Caldwell, a pragmatic man, slammed his hand on the table, and the vibrations ceased. An awkward silence followed, broken by strained laughter and attributions to a passing coal train, though none had been scheduled. From that night forward, the phenomena became a constant, unsettling presence in the Caldwell household. Objects in Timothy's proximity exhibited a life of their own. A Bible would levitate a few inches from his bedside table before softly landing. His school books would flutter their pages as if turned by an unseen breeze. Most disturbingly, the family began to hear a soft, ethereal music, a faint, crystalline chiming, like distant glass bells, that seemed to emanate from the air around the boy, particularly when he was asleep or deep in thought.
The tight-knit community of Blackwood could not long contain such a secret. Whispers spread from porch to porch, from the company store to the mine entrance. The boy's condition was the sole topic of conversation. For some, he was a marvel, a child touched by divine grace. For others, he was an object of fear, a harbinger of something unnatural. The town's minister, while initially cautious, began to see the events as a potential sign from God, a modern-day testament to the power of faith in their humble midst. Josiah Caldwell, however, was consumed by a father's dread. He saw not a miracle, but an affliction threatening his son. The world of a mining foreman was one of cause and effect, of levers and pulleys and measurable force. This defiance of natural law terrified him more than any cave-in ever could. He forbade talk of it within his home, his fear often manifesting as a sharp, uncharacteristic anger. Eleanor, torn between her husband's fear and her own faith, prayed for guidance, her Bible now a source of both comfort and terrifying possibility. The event that shattered the family's fragile attempts at normalcy and catapulted Timothy Caldwell into national infamy occurred on a humid Sunday in July. The Caldwells, as was their custom, were seated in the front pew of the Blackwood Methodist Church. The pastor was midway through his sermon, his voice rising in fervent oration. Timothy, looking pale and slight in his Sunday best, began to fidget. As the pastor reached a climactic pause, a deafening crack echoed through the small church. The large, heavy brass cross that hung on the wall behind the pulpit tore free from its fastenings and flew across the sanctuary as if hurled by a giant's hand. It did not fall. It sailed in a perfect, horrifying arc, landing with a crash at the foot of the Caldwell's pew directly in front of Timothy. The congregation erupted in panic. Women screamed, men shouted. In the chaos, all saw the boy who had fainted dead away into his mother's arms and the cross lying at his feet. There was no natural explanation. The fastenings were found to be old but secure. No one had been near it. In the eyes of the terrified parishioners, an invisible line had been crossed. This was no longer a curious household oddity. It was an event of profound and frightening power, witnessed by dozens. The story, now too explosive for local gossip, was seized upon by a reporter from the Pittsburgh Gazette who happened to be in town visiting family. His sensational account, titled "The Demonic Wonder of Blackwood, a Boy Who Moves Objects with His Mind," would be telegraphed across the nation by the end of the week. Timothy Caldwell was no longer just a Blackwood boy. He had become a problem to be solved, a miracle to be debated, a spectacle to be consumed. The mystery of Timothy Caldwell begins not with a bang, but with a trembling spoon, and escalates into a phenomenon that would captivate and terrify a nation. But this is merely the prologue. To follow the journey of the boy who defied science and the brilliant minds who tried to break him, you must subscribe to the channel. The investigation is about to begin. Hit the bell so you don't miss a moment of the revelation.
The publication of the Pittsburgh Gazette article in the summer of 1867 acted like a lightning rod, attracting a storm of national attention to the secluded town of Blackwood. Almost overnight, the Caldwell household was transformed from a private residence into a public spectacle. The dusty road leading to their door was choked with carriages and curiosity seekers. Reporters from newspapers in Philadelphia, New York, and even Boston took up residence in the town's lone boarding house, their notebooks poised to capture every strange occurrence. Josiah Caldwell, a man who valued his privacy and control above all else, found his home under siege. He initially tried to bar the door, to shield his son from the prying eyes of the world. But the pressure was immense. The town elders, seeing a chance to put Blackwood on the map, urged cooperation. Prominent figures from the Methodist Church arrived, speaking of divine purpose and the opportunity to showcase God's modern wonders. Reluctantly, fearfully, Josiah relented. He would allow investigations, but on his terms. They would be orderly, respectful, and most importantly, they would aim to cure his son, not merely to gawk at him. The first wave of investigators comprised men of God. Reverends, bishops, and self-proclaimed theologians descended upon Blackwood, their Bibles in hand.
They saw in Timothy a potential vessel of the Holy Spirit, a living testament to the literal truth of Scripture. They conducted prayers and exorcisms around the boy, some gentle and beseeching, others loud and confrontational. They would read passages about the miracles of Christ, demanding a sign. The phenomena, however, remained stubbornly inconsistent. Sometimes a chair would tremble during a hymn. Other times, hours of fervent prayer would yield nothing. The boy himself seemed increasingly withdrawn and anxious, the constant scrutiny and religious pressure visibly weighing on his slender frame. The churchmen left divided, some convinced of a divine origin, others suspecting a more sinister, perhaps demonic force was at work. Next came the men of science. The scientific community of the 19th century was fiercely proud, basking in the glow of Darwin's theories and rapid technological advancement. The idea of a boy who could defy the laws of physics was an affront to their entire worldview. A delegation was dispatched from a prestigious university in Philadelphia, led by the renowned neurologist Dr. Alistair Finch and his colleague, the physicist Professor Arthur Vance. They arrived in Blackwood with trunks full of the latest instruments, galvanic batteries to measure nervous energy, chronometers of exquisite precision, magnets and electrical coils. They were skeptics, determined to expose a fraud or diagnose a hitherto unknown medical condition. Their examination was rigorous and impersonal. They subjected Timothy to a battery of tests. They measured his cranial dimensions, searching for the bumps of phrenology that might indicate an aberrant faculty. They tested his reflexes, his eyesight, his hearing. They isolated him in a room, placing objects on marked squares on a table, observing him for hours through a small glass window. Professor Vance set up intricate devices designed to measure fluctuations in magnetic fields or atmospheric pressure. For days, nothing happened. The scientists grew impatient, their skepticism hardening into certainty that they were dealing with a clever hoax, perhaps orchestrated by the parents for fame or money. They began to back their equipment. It was then that Timothy, perhaps sensing their impending dismissal and the failure of his own strange ability, looked at a heavy brass compass on the table. Without a word, without a touch, the compass needle began to spin, faster and faster until it was a blur. Then the entire instrument rose into the air, hovered for a moment at eye level, and then shot across the room, shattering against the far wall. The scientists were stunned in silence. Dr. Finch could find no pulse of epilepsy, no tick of hysteria in the boy. Professor Vance could find no hidden wires, no magnets, no possible physical cause. They repeated their tests, and over the next week witnessed a catalog of wonders. Levitation of small objects, abrupt temperature drops in Timothy's immediate vicinity, and the now characteristic spontaneous chimes of ethereal glass. The phenomena were real. Science, for the first time, had been presented with evidence it could not explain, and it was utterly baffled. Dr. Finch would later write in his notes, "We are confronted with not a disease, but a fundamental anomaly. The boy is a locked door for which we have no key."
Josiah Caldwell threw these last groups out with furious indignation. His son was not a circus act or a parlor trick. The conflicting conclusions of the divines and the scientists had left the family more confused and isolated than ever. The town of Blackwood was similarly divided, its social fabric fraying under the strain. Friendships soured over debates about the boy's nature. The family was viewed with a mixture of awe, fear, and suspicion. Timothy became a ghost in his own town, shunned by former playmates, his every movement watched and whispered about. The pressure within the Caldwell home reached a breaking point. Josiah's fear festered into a deep, silent anger. Eleanor's faith began to crack under the weight of so much conflicting dogma. And Timothy, the quiet boy at the center of the storm, retreated further into himself, a prisoner of the very phenomenon that defined him. The world's greatest minds were left baffled by a simple boy from a mining town.
But the true cost of this mystery was being paid behind closed doors in the heart of a family tearing itself apart. The story is about to take a dark and dangerous turn. To understand the price of a miracle, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter. The unrelenting scrutiny of the outside world turned the Caldwell household into a gilded cage. The initial curiosity had curdled into a pervasive atmosphere of dread and performance. Every meal, every conversation, every moment of silence was conducted under the unseen eyes of an expectant world, waiting for the next miraculous event. The house, once a sanctuary, was now a laboratory, a church, and a theater all at once, and the Caldwell family were its unwilling actors. The greatest burden fell upon Timothy. The quiet, thoughtful boy was now pale and perpetually exhausted. The phenomena, once sporadic, seemed to be growing more frequent and more powerful, but at a terrible cost. Each event left him drained and weak, as if the energy required to move a compass or levitate a book was drawn directly from his own life force. He began to suffer from crippling headaches and bouts of profound lethargy that would leave him bedridden for days. The ethereal chiming that surrounded him now often escalated into a painful internal ringing in his ears that no one else could hear, a private symphony of torment. He was no longer the subject of his own life. He was a passenger in a body that had become a conduit for forces he could not understand or control. His relationship with his father Josiah deteriorated into a silent Cold War. Josiah was a man who built his identity on control of his mind, his workers, his family, his destiny. Timothy's condition was the ultimate loss of control, a chaotic and humiliating public spectacle that defied everything he stood for. His fear for his son mutated into a deep-seated, unspoken anger. He could not comprehend the phenomenon, so he began to resent its source. He spoke to Timothy less, his touches became brusque, and he spent longer and longer hours at the mine, avoiding the oppressive atmosphere of his own home. He took to drinking, seeking solace in whiskey, which only amplified his sullen bitterness. In his darkest moments, he wondered if his son was somehow cursed, a punishment for some unknown sin. Eleanor Caldwell was trapped in the agonizing space between her husband and her child. Her steadfast faith, once her rock, now authored conflicting answers. Was this God's work? Then why did it cause her son such pain and her family such ruin? Was it demonic? The thought was too terrible to entertain. She became the family's frantic peacemaker, trying to bridge the chasm between Josiah's rigid anger and Timothy's fragile suffering. She prayed until her knees were sore, not for a sign, but for an end. The strain etched new lines on her face and stole the light from her eyes. The vibrant matriarch of Blackwood was fading, replaced by a haunted, weary woman.
The town of Blackwood, once a unified community, was now a tinderbox of rumor and suspicion. The division was no longer a polite debate, it was a schism. Families who had been neighbors for generations stopped speaking to each other. The believers, led by the local pastor, saw the Caldwells as chosen, and any misfortune that befell them was a test of faith. The skeptics, led by more pragmatic townsfolk and those influenced by the scientists' bafflement, viewed the family with distrust and fear. They whispered of demonic pacts and bad blood. Timothy's former friends were forbidden from playing with him. Shopkeepers were hesitant to serve Eleanor, their politeness now laced with a nervous fear. This social ostracism culminated in an act of pure malice. One October night, as a cold wind whipped through the town, a rock came crashing through the Caldwell's parlor window. Wrapped around it was a crude note, scrawled in angry letters. "Sorcerer, leave our town or suffer the consequences." It was signed only by
concerned citizens. Josiah Caldwell stared at the rock in his hand, his face a mask of fury and shame. The external world's fascination had now become an active threat. His own community had turned against his son. The event seemed to shatter something final within Timothy. That night, the household was awakened by a sound like a thunderclap emanating from the boy's room. They rushed in to find Timothy unconscious on the floor, and every piece of furniture in the room, the bed, the dresser, the chair, had been thrown against the walls as if by a massive explosion, though the windows were still intact. It was the most violent manifestation yet, a psychic eruption of the boy's fear, pain, and isolation. The following morning, a determined and desperate Josiah Caldwell made a decision. The men of God had failed. The men of science had failed. The town had turned hostile. There was only one path left, one that appealed to his pragmatic need for a solution, no matter how dark. He announced to a terrified Eleanor that he was sending for someone new, a man from Boston who did not deal in prayer or physics, but in the mind. He was bringing in an alienist, an early psychiatrist, a Dr. Samuel Thorne, who claimed expertise in nervous disorders of a spectacular nature. Josiah was no longer seeking a miracle or a discovery. He was seeking a cure, even if that cure meant confining his son to an asylum. The boy, who was once a wonder, had become a patient, and his home was now a prison, awaiting the arrival of its final jailer. The human cost of mystery is often greater than the mystery itself. A family is broken, a town is divided, and a boy is suffering. But the most invasive examination is yet to come. To witness the arrival of a new kind of doctor with a terrifying theory, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. The darkest chapter of Timothy's story is about to unfold.
Dr. Samuel Thorne arrived in Blackwood in November of 1867, a stark figure against the gray, late autumn landscape. He was a man of the new science of the mind, a disciple of the emerging theories of neurology and psychology that were beginning to challenge purely spiritual or supernatural explanations for human behavior. Where the theologian saw a divine vessel and the physicist saw a physical anomaly, Thorne saw a psyche, a complex and potentially broken one. He was a sharp, observant man in his 50s, with cold, analytical eyes that missed nothing. He carried with him not scientific instruments, but a notebook and a disconcerting, unwavering calm. His reputation was built on dealing with cases of hysteria, particularly in women and children, and he approached the Caldwell affair not with wonder or fear, but with the detached curiosity of an entomologist studying a rare insect. To Josiah Caldwell, this clinical detachment was a relief. It promised a solution, not a sermon. To Eleanor, it felt cold and inhuman. Thorne's method was different from all who had come before. He did not immediately test Timothy or demand demonstrations. Instead, he installed himself in the Caldwell home for a week, observing the family dynamic with a quiet, unnerving intensity. He noted the tension between Josiah and Timothy, the silent meals, the father's averted gaze, the mother's desperate attempts at normalcy. He interviewed the parents separately, probing their histories, their marriage, and the circumstances of Timothy's birth and early childhood. He spent hours alone with Timothy, not asking about the phenomena, but simply talking about his dreams, his fears, and his life before the troubles began. It was during these conversations that Dr. Thorne began to form his radical theory. He learned of a traumatic event that had occurred 2 years prior, an event the family had scarcely mentioned to previous investigators, deeming it unrelated. In the summer of 1865, there had been a minor collapse in the Blackwood No. 3 mine.
Josiah, as foreman, had been underground. For 3 agonizing hours, the town feared the worst. Timothy, then 9 years old, had stood with his mother at the mine entrance, witnessing the panic, the screams of other families, the terrifying uncertainty. Josiah had emerged unscathed, but the boy had been profoundly shaken. He had nightmares for months and developed a fear of enclosed spaces. Dr. Thorne seized upon this information. In the developing language of alienism, he began to formulate a diagnosis of traumatic hysteria. He theorized that the intense psychic trauma of nearly losing his father had fractured something in Timothy's young mind. The boy's unconscious, unable to process the terror and helplessness of that day, had created a spectacular physical manifestation of that repressed energy. The moving objects were not miracles or tricks. They were symptoms. They were a desperate, unconscious cry for help, a way for his psyche to externalize an internal agony too vast to contain. The phenomena, Thorne argued, were a language, a destructive, dangerous language of a mind trying to speak its pain. His treatment plan was as radical as his theory. He proposed to essentially break the boy's will, to force the unconscious mind to relinquish its control. He argued that by subjecting Timothy to a controlled, less severe version of the original trauma, specifically by confronting his fear of enclosure and his fear for his father's safety, they could force the hysterical symptoms to abate. It was a brutal, psychological countershock. Josiah, desperate for any solution, agreed. Over Eleanor's tearful protests, Thorne put his plan into action. He took Timothy down to the mouth of the Blackwood No. 3 mine. The boy was visibly terrified, shaking and pale. Then Thorne instructed Josiah, against every paternal instinct, to descend into the mine and not come out until called. Timothy was left at the entrance with the doctor, forced to relive the awful wait of 2 years prior. As minutes stretched into an hour, the boy's anxiety became unbearable. The air around him grew cold. Small stones on the ground began to tremble.
Then a low rumble was heard from within the mine. It was just a cart moving on its tracks, a normal sound, but to Timothy, it was the sound of the collapse. He screamed, and in that moment a massive wooden support beam at the mine entrance, weighing hundreds of pounds, splintered and tore free from its housing, swinging violently into the space where the boy stood. It was only the quick action of a nearby miner who pulled Timothy aside that saved him from being crushed. The experiment was an unmitigated disaster. Thorne's attempt to control the trauma had instead unleashed its full, lethal power. The alienist for the first time looked shaken. His clinical theories had not accounted for the sheer physical reality of the force he was attempting to manipulate. He had treated the phenomenon as a metaphor, but it had responded with literal, deadly violence. He packed his bags and left Blackwood the next day, his notes incomplete, his theory in tatters, his confidence shattered. He had not cured Timothy, he had nearly gotten him killed. The failure of Dr. Thorne was the final straw for Josiah Caldwell. All avenues were exhausted. God, science, and now the mind, all had failed. The rock through the window, the violent manifestation at the mine, and the terrified, broken look in his son's eyes coalesced into a single terrible realization. They could not stay in Blackwood. The town was killing his son as surely as any disease. 1 week later, under the cover of a pre-dawn darkness, the Caldwell family packed a few belongings into a wagon and fled the town that had been their home for generations. They left behind their house, Josiah's job, and their entire history, becoming refugees from a mystery they could not solve. They disappeared into the anonymous American landscape, leaving only a ghost story behind. The experts had all failed, and a family was forced into exile. But what became of Timothy Caldwell? The story doesn't end with the disappearance.
it evolves into a national legend. To follow the enduring mystery of the boy science couldn't explain, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the final chapter. The disappearance of the Caldwell family in the winter of 1867 did not end the story of Timothy. It merely transformed it from a current event into an enduring American legend. Their wagon vanished down the road away from Blackwood and from the pages of documented history. They became ghosts, their fates a blank canvas upon which the nation would project its anxieties, its beliefs, and its endless fascination with the unknown. In the immediate aftermath, the town of Blackwood was left with a collective hangover of guilt, shame, and unresolved curiosity. The concerned citizens who had thrown the rock found their victory hollow. The phenomenon was gone, but so was a family they had known their entire lives. The pastor who had seen divine purpose now grappled with the moral consequences of his fervor. The scientists who had been baffled published their findings in obscure journals. Their dry accounts of levitating compasses and spontaneous acoustics read with skepticism by colleagues who dismissed them as the result of flawed observation or outright fraud. The case of Timothy Caldwell became a footnote, a curious anomaly that didn't fit the prevailing scientific paradigm and was therefore conveniently ignored. Yet the story refused to die. It seeped into the folklore of Western Pennsylvania. Tales of the Wonder Boy of Blackwood were told for decades afterward, growing more elaborate with each telling. He became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked curiosity, a ghost story to frighten children, and a legend spoken of in hushed tones in mining towns, where the deep earth already held enough secrets and superstitions. Theories about their fate proliferated. Some said the family had changed their names and moved to a remote farm in the Midwest, where Timothy lived out his days in quiet isolation, learning to suppress his terrible gift. Others believed he had been institutionalized by his father, hidden away in a private asylum where his abilities could be contained. A darker strain of rumor suggested that the constant drain of his power had eventually consumed him, leading to an early death from exhaustion, his grave unmarked and unknown. The most persistent legend, however, was one of recruitment. In the late 19th century, stories circulated that Timothy's abilities had attracted the attention of a shadowy, quasi-scientific organization dedicated to the study of the paranormal, a precursor to the later societies for psychical research. This group, the story went, had tracked the family down and offered them protection and secrecy in exchange for the opportunity to study Timothy in a controlled, benevolent environment. In this version, Timothy lived a long life, not as a patient or a freak, but as the subject of the world's most secretive and important experiment, his contributions hidden from the public view.
Ultimately, the unanswered question of Timothy Caldwell is what makes him so compelling. There is no closure. We don't know if he was a psychic prodigy, a medical marvel, or a tragic victim of hysteria. We don't know if he found peace or died in misery. This lack of resolution is frustrating, but it is also the source of the story's power. It forces us to confront our own beliefs. Do we side with the scientists, the priests, or the alienist? Do we believe the witnesses or suspect mass delusion? Timothy Caldwell is more than a historical footnote. He is a permanent question mark. He is a reminder that history is not just about the facts we can prove, but about the mysteries we cannot solve. His brief, brilliant, and tragic appearance on the stage of history challenges us to be humble in our knowledge, compassionate in our judgments, and open to the possibility that the world is still a far stranger and more wonderful place than our current sciences can explain. His silence echoes through the years,
not as an absence of truth, but as an invitation to never stop questioning. The story of Timothy Caldwell is a testament to the fact that some mysteries are never solved. They simply become part of us. If you are captivated by the unresolved, by the stories that challenge our very understanding of reality, then your journey into the unknown is just beginning. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell. We are always searching for the truth, no matter how elusive it may be.